Thank you, Sam. Time has sort of sneaked up on me, so that in the past 6 lessons I've been able to cover only about 2.5 centuries. You know, I still think that's quite a feat to cover 2.5 centuries in 6 lessons, but I'm lucky tonight. I've got some help. So I'm going to try to catch up so that we won't miss too much of the next 75 years of our history. Very briefly, later I'll mention a few important events of the late 1800s and early 1900s. But first, I don't want you to miss the history of the hat shop, so I've asked Holly, one of the executives there for nearly 40 years, to tell you about that. Holly, do you want to take over?
Mm-hmm.
Here, I think you need this.
Oh, yeah, that thing. I don't know what to do with it.
All you have to do is talk.
Okay. I can do that, I guess. Well, about 10 years ago, I guess now, a woman from the Elizabeth H. Whittier Club asked me one day after church if I would be willing to write up a talk on the Merrimack Hat Company for posterity. And she was going to get the somebody in the automobiles and so forth to do the same. Well, I'd never done it, and I hesitated, but I said I would, like a down pool. And so I went at it. Took a couple of months. And these are excerpts from it. It takes 12 or 14 or 15 pages, and I then we put it on a tape, and it's in the library for anybody that wants to hear it. It takes about 3/4 of an hour. They have a machine, and it covers the hat business as well as you can cover it in a brief period. It would take a day to cover it. They were in business, of course, many, many years. So this is what we got out of it. 1856, the first hat company in Amesbury was incorporated by Abner Bailey, and this hat company was in the building which was formerly on the corner of Main Street and Pleasant Valley Road, right on the corner, just this side of where the marina is. And that was in business for quite a while. In 1863, the Amesbury Hat, that was called incidentally, it was purchased by the Merrimack Hat Company. And I'd like to just, before I get started too much, have you know, I don't know what you know with a hat body. This is what we call a hat body. Now, this is the body ready to be trimmed. It has to be shaped. It's been felted, as you can see. It has to be trimmed, and then it goes to go ahead of mine. And this is just another. This one has been shaped a little more. And that was the main. These are wool hat bodies, and Merrimack made both wool and felt hats. The first big event for Merrimack Hat wasn't the hats, but it was a bazaar for the old ladies' home in 1877. And they were building one of the buildings, which now is number 1. And if you go by it today, there's in brick, there's 1877 on it still. And Merrimack at that time was going along in pretty good shape. In 1893, they started to make, they made felt hats of rabbit fur. Now, the beaver hats were very popular. You probably, some of you have seen some old beaver. They were particularly, they made taller hats, like the silk hat. And if you had a fur felt, a rabbit, a beaver hat, you were somebody. I mean, and that was a remarkable distinction. And they made those for years, and then they got into the wool hat, made of sheep's wool. The first, in 1900, was the first complete women's hat. And at that time, they had their troubles with women's hats, with the styles and so forth. They'd had their troubles since they started. They'd had a fire, and they'd had, of course, there was all of the water around the plants down there, and they'd been up and down and had their troubles, but they were really starting to get on their feet. In 1920, they started to get larger, and they bought the Air Houston Hat Company of Portland, Maine. And the company at one time, proceeding from that, had 5 plants and 4 sales offices employing about 2,300 people in all the plants. They'd made millions of hat bodies and finished hats. I have some figures I'll read. They're not too interesting, but they give you a better idea of what I can of what they made. In 1926, they bought a big plant in West Upton, Mass, known as the William Knowlton Company. And they made ladies' finished hats. Merrimack made ladies' finished hats for a while. And you probably all, I was sorry I didn't have one, but evidently I didn't save one after the plant closed, and I don't know if anybody, there were probably people here that have them. They had turned up brims, you know, and they had turned up brims with feathers in them, and they had feathers on top, and everything you could think of in the hat line they shipped. When I first went to work in 1929, they were shipping out dozens and dozens and dozens of ladies' finished hats, and they were all shapes and sizes. They made millions of hat bodies and finished hats. 1926, they had bought this plant in West Upton. 1941, they bought the Duchess hat in Beacon, New York. That was what we call a back shop, made nothing but the bodies and sold them that way. In 1941, they built a new plant, the only new plant they ever had, in Greenville, Alabama. And that went on for quite a number of years. Later, they bought a plant in Truro, Nova Scotia. And you may wonder how they got rid of all these hats. This was millions of dozens of hat bodies. Now, that's a lot of hat bodies in a year. And at one time, they were making 26,000 dozen hat bodies a week in these plants. And they were the second largest hat company in the country, Hat Corporation of America being the largest. They had the finished hats, and they were making more finished ladies' hats then. They had 3 or 4 different names. These were their logo type hat, registered. The Brewster hat, the Thornton hat, and the Layton hat, and there were several others. And I'd like to pass this brochure around, which at that time they were very prosperous and were doing very well, and they put out this brochure, and it's called Making the Headlines, and it's a beautifully done job. If you would just pass it around, I think you'd be interested in seeing the people that were some of the people that were working, what they did, and so forth. I'm not going to get into the hat making itself because that can be quite a story, and I don't think it's that interesting. It just tells how they start and what processes they go through and how they finish up and how they're sold and so forth. But they did have these 4 sales offices in New York selling hat bodies, fur and felt. And these people would sell to finished hat manufacturers. They 26,000 I have down here a note, 26,000 dozen per week. 1,351,000. Now that's dozen. 1,351,000 dozen hats in a year. Now that's a lot of hats. 1954, the wool hat business started to dwindle. Unfortunately, ladies gave up wearing hats, and the cost of getting the raw fur in was just too much, just more than they could make at one time. The raw fur that they used cost them more than the importers could import a whole complete hat body. And that just doesn't, as you can see, that just doesn't pay off. So in 1954, they closed the plant on Merrimack Street and just saved the plant, the 2 plants on Cedar Street. This was in they started that plant in 1936, and then in 54, they closed the one in Merrimack Street and just had the fur plant on Cedar Street. The union came in 1940, and it was a good union, I'll say that. Frank Sinuski was the agent, and he and I used to have some pretty good times talking and discussing and battling and so forth and so on, but it always came out pretty well. And they were a good union to do business with. In 1958, a man named Farley, a millionaire named Farley from Boston, owned 85% of the Merrimack stock. And he was 86 years old and decided he'd had enough, and he wanted to liquidate his assets, so he told Everett Brown, who was then president, Everett, we're getting out. I'm going to get out, and we're going to sell it, unless you can find somebody who wants to buy it. And if you can, that's wonderful, but I've had enough. Well, of course, that was an awful blow to the town of Amesbury, and it was an awful blow to many, many individuals. At that time, they employed about 325 people up on Cedar Street. And they were interested, of course, the union, in keeping the shop going, as well as townspeople. They finally get together 3 different outfits. The people that sold us the rabbit fur to make the hats, of course, did a big business with us. And the people that sold our hat bodies did a big business. And the union was, of course, interested. And the 3 of them got together and issued 10,000 shares of stock. They sold stock to everybody that was interested. The union kept the majority of it. They sold stock for $50 a share, and they reopened. They closed down in 58, and later in 58 they opened up. And at that time, within 2 weeks of that time, 95% of our employees owned 1 or more shares. And there was nothing like this in the country. Now, I'm telling you this generally because this is something that's countrywide at the time. This company at that time was owned by a union. It was managed by a union and controlled completely by a union. And there was nothing like it in the country, of course. Alex Rose was vice president of the Liberal Party in New York, and he was president of the union at the time and also president of Merrimack Hat. They did very well. They took over in '58 and did very well, as long as hats were being used, one, and the tariffs weren't too bad. In the first several years, they paid a dividend, and then they got down to the point where they couldn't pay a dividend, but still they worked. And finally, in 1970, in December 1970, they had to give up, and the union met at the shop and voted to close the plant, and it was sold in 1972. But it was a big thing. I can remember the days when the union was taking over at the plant. There were televisions outside, and there were practically every magazine had an article on this countrywide unique situation. And then trouble began to appear, and first they couldn't pay a dividend, then hatlessness and tariff got worse and worse, and they finally had to throw in the sponge. And it was a sad day for Amesbury, because this place had been going since 1856, and there's nothing like it anywhere around here, and that's the very brief history of it, and I hope you enjoyed it. That's about all I can tell you. If you tried to go into it, I'd be here for a week, but that's it, and I thank you very much for listening, and I hope you get something from it.
You want to answer any questions?
Yeah. I don't know whether I can answer it, but I'd be willing to try to answer questions about it.
The reason that the hat business went out was because the styles of hats changed, so they just weren't wearing felt hats anymore, or did they just suddenly go hatless? I mean, I was in the midst of the thing, but I don't...
They went hatlessness. I don't remember, and my memory is only 2 inches long anyway, but it was over a period of probably 4 or 5 years when hatlessness gradually picked up. First it was the women that didn't wear them, and then it was the men, and then they got bigger and bigger. But the main thing was that when they sold us I've forgotten how much, probably about a pound of fur, raw fur, to use for a hat, it cost them, the company, more to buy that raw fur than what it cost Merrimack, rather, more to buy that pound or whatever it was of fur than it did complete hat body from one of the plants in Italy, Baltimore, over there. And half the work had been done on it already. So you see, they just couldn't compete with it. And they did all they could, but I think it was a good place to work. I was there 39, 40 years. And we had some good times. It had some good workers, had some wonderful workers. And I think they were all interested in the jobs, and it was I think it was well run by the people that ran it, and it was just one of those things that automatically happen sometimes. Thank you.
How were the fur fibers bonded together to make the fabric?
Pardon me?
How was the rabbit fur itself bonded together to make a fabric that you could make a hat out of?
You're talking on a different other subject, but I'm tell you. If you take a piece of rabbit fur and put it under a microscope, John Ross is here, he was a chemist, so he's probably going to say you're wrong, but I mean, he knows more than that of it. But anyway, you take one piece of fur and put it under a strong microscope, and you'll see that it has little barbs on it, like fish hooks, and they stay together as long as it's dry and there's nothing to pull it apart. But when they sprayed this in New York or wherever we bought the fur, if you sprayed that with mercury, it brought that little fish hook fiber out here so that it was then ready to felt, what we call felt, hook into another piece. And that was the purpose of the soaking of that. And it really, it bothers me because this gentleman that owns the plant, we moved the fur plant up on Cedar Street in 1936. As far as I know, there was never a wool piece of fur got down around the main plant. They took bearings, several companies took bearings today, if you sell something to a company that isn't right, they can sue you and so forth and so on. So these companies took bearings to be sure there wasn't any lead in them, and they didn't, in my estimation, didn't take it in quite the round place. The lead came in and the bales of fur that went into an old carriage shed, and stayed there until they got ready to use it. But when they used it, where they used it and where the lead would ordinarily come out, you expect, is when they had these long machines, half as long as this room, with boiling hot water. And they ran the hats on an apron. They piled the hat, these flat bodies on, piled it on, and this thing went over back and forth. They put it through one way and then turned around and sent it back. And that's where the hot water, the boiling hot water, went through the hat and soaked it and so forth. They never seemed to find any results of the fur down there, but this was in a place that, now mind you, we hadn't had anything. There hadn't been any fur in this plant on Merrimack Street since 1936. This was about 5 years ago. The state came in and made this gentleman dig, and he dug out 200 loads of loam, which supposedly had some white lead in it. It was taken somewhere.
Mercury.
I don't know if anybody, mercury, I'm sorry. I was curious and tried to find out where it went, because you can't just pour that stuff anywhere. And I finally found that there were 600 loads, 200 loads at $3,000 a load. Now this was 1970. This hadn't been, we haven't had fur down here since 1936. And this was about 4 years ago, about 91, I guess. And here they were digging this stuff up, taking it down. It cost them $600,000. And they tried to find out where it went. And they're very cagey about that, because nobody wants it, Somebody said that eventually, a fellow told me from New York that lived out there that he was pretty sure that some of it was dumped down Niagara Falls. But when you think about that, it's a kind of an eerie proposition. We hadn't had anything in the mercury line anywhere near that plant since 1936. And this was about 1989 and 90 that they took this away and threw it out.
And all the time that mercury was in the land for those years, there was never any records of anybody ever getting any sickness or anything else from it. No. Is that correct?
I handle one of my jobs in being labor relations was handling workman's compensation insurance. And we had a lot of people over the years, probably had 9,000 people. They had all kinds of things and so forth, and every once in a while there'd be somebody come up with an itch and other troubles that you would have if you had mercury poisoning. We'd send them right to Dr. Pye, and the doctor died the minute we had thought there was any chance of it. And I say this crossing my heart that I never knew, and no doctor ever said, I never knew of any person having mercury poisoning. Not only in the Merrimack, in this town and in the area. So, but that's what they do. Any other questions?
Ollie?
Yes.
As the hat factory was starting to slide and go out of business, how much of a factor was international competition, foreign competition?
How much what?
The factor was the foreign competition?
Well, I don't know which was the biggest factor, people not wearing hats, but it both happened during the same, probably several years, and it just built up. And there was nothing you could do about either one of them. You can't tell somebody they're going to wear a hat. No, that doesn't go very big. And you can't, we went to, I remember the union and the president of the company to get together and get down to Washington and see all the big shots down there and talk with them, and they'd all, yeah, too bad, yeah. I saw a letter once that came from the, well, it was one of the big departments in Washington. It was the one that tourists go places on. What's the name of it? I can't think, but it came from the tariff department. The tariff department had this from this outfit, and they had said, you can do all you want when we're in favor of this tariff, but you can't do anything because the department that we're in charge of is the people that handle the tourists and the people that bring business into our country. These are foreign people. Bring business into our this country. They bring tourists in, and if you do any of this, if we cut tariffs and so forth, that's going to be gone, and you just can't. This is doing the tariff department. There's another department. You just can't do anything with it. And that's what we were up against at that time. And the company, so they were out of business for 2 years. They voted in December and of 1970 that they would go out of business. We sold out, finally sold to 3 people from Lawrence who bought the whole works. And that was the end of that, the hats in Amesbury, as far as I know. Any more questions? Yes, Jim.
Do they use glue in the manufacture of, or did they use glue in the manufacture of those hats?
Glue?
Glue?
Any kind of a glue or adhesive?
Not that I ever know.
I was wondering if that had any connection with the expression, mad as a hatter.
I'm glad you asked that question, Jim. I'm glad you asked that question because I don't know. Supposedly, Danbury was the hat capital of the country, and I don't know the world. And they had what they call mercury poisoning. And once in a while, one of the men around would come up with this. They call them Danbury shakes. They shook, and they lost their teeth and so forth, and really went to pieces, I guess. And I don't know how big it was ham or anything else, but that's all I ever knew of it.
Ollie, can I add a word here too?
Sure. You should, John.
Ollie suggests that when you look at hair fiber or a fur fiber under a microscope, you can see some barbed or something. Your own hair has all animal fiber. Is not made as a straight, shiny fiber like, well, like silk or something would be. It has scales on it, and the scales all point in one direction. So if a whole mass of it, you begin to pound it and hammer it, it goes in this way, but it only comes out half the way because of those scales will interfere with it coming back. So the next time you hammer it a little bit in, it goes in, and then it comes out a little, it goes in some more. And that's the reason why the material does felt, why it does become more compact, why it gets harder and thicker and something you could use to make a hat with. And that also goes back to the woolen mills, the fulling mills you've heard about in New England in early times. Was people at home did their own spinning, and they wove cloth, but it was a very loose cloth. They couldn't get it tight, so they took it to a fulling mill. Now this is wool cloth, and had it fulled to tighten it up, so that it was more firm, more usable.
John, the thing that I used to talk with you about, enjoy talking with you about, and the fact that it was hard to believe, but I guess it's so. I think you told me once that this stuff we're talking about, mercury, if it got in the ground, it didn't move. And it doesn't evaporate. And I don't see how it wouldn't just last there.
Well, it was mercury salt, Holly, more than just plain mercury. You see, the fur was not treated with mercury. It was treated with mercury dissolved in nitric acid, if you want to imagine what that might be. And it was put onto the fur, tips of the fur fibers. And the salts that resulted from some of that were volatile. And mercury is a little volatile itself, but so be it, it's there. And the salts wouldn't evaporate from the ground. The mercury itself might over years and years and years evaporate, but not the mercury salts. They'd stay that way.
Well, thank you, John. And thank you, Holly. That was very interesting.
You're welcome.
And now, I think all of us realize how much the hat shop contributed to the Amesbury economy. And of course, one of the other firms in town that contributed a great deal was the Bailey Company. And Sam has kindly offered to show us some slides on the Bailey Electric. And I think it may be of interest to know that just within a few years, California has decreed that automobile manufacturers working in that state must produce emission-free free cars. And that means that they are having to go back to the electric car. And certainly, I think S.R. Bailey would be very gratified if he could see the trend today. Do you want to give you a little talk now, Sam? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Now, I have a collection here of about 60-odd photographs of Bailey Electrics, and these were all taken in 1913. Now, some of the cars were made before that, but the photographs were all in 1913, and I have these. Just turn it on. And these photographs are all on this CD disc. It's something relatively new now, and it was something that I found that I could get pictures through a computer. They can put pictures onto a CD disc from 35mm negatives. And I had some pictures that I had photographed, got the negatives, and then had this done. Let's see if I can get this going again. This particular picture here was taken down on the lawn of 381 Main Street, and it was, this was my grandfather, and I'm not just sure whether that was my grandmother or not in the picture, but it's interesting to note, you can look upriver here and see the entrance to the Powwow River, and it shows the buildings where the coal walks were. I think it was Cram's Coal Walk on one side of the river, and the upriver corner was,
Ames.
Morris Ames, wasn't it? And I will... Now here's a picture of a car that was, several were made for the Yonkers Electric Light Company down in New York. And this particular model was made, and it had a ladder that was built into the unit, and they could use it to go up and change light bulbs, turned out light bulbs or street light bulbs. And this is a picture of some of the men. This picture is taken in the Bailey Company back in the times of making the Bailey Electrics, and I have a marked photograph at home that names all of the people that were in the picture. And I think this one was my grandfather back here, but I don't remember offhand who the others were. And I'm going to eventually put this on videotape and narrate the tape, and then I won't have to stand and describe things as we look at them. Now there's that period, that must have been their idea of a panel truck. And let's see. Now this is on one of the steepest streets in Amesbury, and they're demonstrating how the car could climb the hill, I guess. That was my grandfather, Colonel Bailey. And that house is almost identical to the way you see it right there today. And this is the street. It's Atlantic Avenue. It's on Elm Street, just about across from the laundry there. Now, these are some pictures of some parts of the car that were laid out apparently on a large sheet of paper or whatnot to take pictures of them. And when I had these put on the disc, I had all of the pictures put on regardless of how much interest there was in them. And when I probably put this on tape, I'll pick out representative pictures and not put all of them on there. But this shows the, I think that's the, not sure, that's part of the front wheel assembly for the axles for that. Now this is another picture of that Yonkers electric car, but this picture was taken right in back of what was the old S.R. Bailey plant on Chestnut Street. And as you look this way, you're looking towards Elm Street. And this cupola on the building looks like a church steeple, is there today, and it's in the house that Shorty Flanders used to live in. Right about across, what is it, Spring Street, about off the end of Spring Street.
That was the old T.W. Lane house originally.
Oh, it was. Well, I didn't realize that. There's another picture in the same area. Now this shows a close-up showing the instrument panel. They had this spotlight mounted there so that when a man went up on the telephone pole to change the bulb, they could aim that light right on the light fixture on the pole so that he'd have it well lit while he was up there working. This is old Tom Robbins. I don't know whether Wendell Jenkins may remember him. He lived in the house that your brother, not your brother, your brother-in-law lives in now, Ray Davis. Where's Ray? Ray here tonight? Yeah. You remember old Tom?
No, not you mentioned.
Yeah, he worked at the shop down on Water Street as a buffer I remember back in the 30s. Oops, there. Now this is the old S.R. Bailey plant in the background, and Chestnut Street would be running just along on the other side of the building. All of these are chimneys, and they went down inside, and they'd have a blacksmith forge at every one of those, at those chimneys, because they did a great deal of steel forgings for the electrics as well as the carriages. Now this is a rear view showing the ladder up on that particular track. This is the Market Street Baptist Church over in the background in the distance there. Every once in a while they printed one of those in the wrong direction, so I have to turn it over. That's a front view of the same vehicle. And this was lumberyard and so forth out back. There's that same steeple. You could cross from Chestnut Street, well, right now, just about the end of Oakland Street, you can cross Chestnut Street and go around and come out on Washington Street and out onto Elm Street. That's a rear view. Okay, that's a repeat. Now that's a little different version. The back doors are open on that van or truck, whatever it was. And this is another view. I haven't located just where this picture was taken in town.
Sam, did these electrics have a wooden frame like the old Franklin and the...
They were mostly forged steel, but they did have some panels of wood in them. And of course, I think the seat supports and whatnot, they had quite a bit of wood. I'm not sure just where that picture was taken. This was a roadster, two-passenger. And they drove, my grandfather drove one of these out to Chicago. And I don't recall now what the time was, but I have the write-up of at home of his whole trip, the diary of the going out. They had many days of rain, muddy roads, and problems and whatnot, but he made it out and was never once had any mechanical failures on the vehicle. And also this vehicle had climbed Mount Washington back in that period of the around 1913.
Sammy, is anybody making an electric car today?
Are there anywhere?
Is anybody making one today?
Well, there are electric cars being made, but not Bailey Electrics. I was trying to think who it is, whether it's tied in with New England Power or what, but they had several cars made up, and they were going to let people use them in commuting cars and keep records on how they made out.
I believe there are several firms in California that are making them now.
Oh. You can see the fur coat and collar and the unpaved roads. Now there's a four-door touring car. Another view of it with the top up. That's a repeat of... This is another picture from the same location where we
but down on the river before. The Powwow River's back in the corner over here. And this is a repeat of the other one. And it's interesting to note, I can take any part of this picture and put that frame where we want it, and then put on a telephoto, and it's going right up. Now you can see those buildings up there in the Powwow much better. Now I understand this picture was taken driving up Lombard Avenue. There are a lot of pictures and memorabilia and records of the old Bailey Company in the town library, and I was in there on several occasions, and they pulled out several cartons of material out of the archives, and I sat down there at a table for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 times, going through them, and a lot of these pictures were there with notes on the back of them.
Were those glass plates that Alan Partman made up?
Yeah. But there were prints of them down there. Now this picture, it's interesting to note, this house and this house are both on Winkley Street, where Winkley Street crosses Hillside Avenue. And notice the car tracks in here coming in from Haverhill, headed into town. And this used to be old Doc Ryan's house, and this was my grandfather's house. And just
going into town from Haverhill Road to town?
Yeah. Another picture, similar, same area. This is a completely unrelated picture that happened to be in the collection, and I was able to enlarge this to a point where I could read on the trolley car, it said Plum Island on it. I said, well, if that was Plum Island, because I was wondering where this would be in the entire railway division of the trolley cars, whether it was Haverhill, Merrimack, or where. Well, when it said Plum Island, I said, well, that would have to be between Market Square, Newburyport, and Plum Island, and with houses like that, it had to be between Ocean Avenue and Water Street, and State Street and Ocean Avenue. I talked with Mal Hudson, and he said, well, I remember that. I was a kid brought up in this area, and he said that used to come down and then take a left-hand turn and then a sharp right again, and I was going to get him sometime when he had time and try to find the exact location where that picture was taken, see how many buildings might be there. Now, this is a picture, and there are a number of pictures taken in this location, and this is up on the top of Rocky Hill Road, and this is what was the old Portsmouth Road, and the Rocky Hill Meeting Church is just out of the picture there. Now, the Rocky Hill Meeting House would be up in here, and that's the old Collins residence. And when 495 was put in, that was moved in back of the Rocky Hill Meeting House. This is looking just the opposite way, right towards Rocky Hill Road. And this building here used to be Mellon's Inn at one time, some time ago, and this was a barn that went with it, and that's since been torn down. This is a picture showing the interior of the car looking through the open door. And now here we are back up on Hillside Avenue again, and there's a picture of a wagon down the road a ways here. Let's see if we can. Yeah. Now, see the horse and wagon down here? And that was a part of Harvey Terry's house, which was just about where 495 goes under Elm Street now. This is the rear view of that same touring car, and you can see this is the house that Bill Evans used to live in, right at the top of Rocky Hill Road at the corner of Elm Street, and that's the old Mellon's Inn. Let's see. Now this is a top view looking into the rear of the touring car. Front view of the same vehicle.
Somebody local take these, Sam?
Did I what?
Somebody local take these?
Oh, Allie Parkman, too. You remember Allie Parkman?
Yeah.
Well, he had taken these. He was a professional photographer at the time, as well as being a first-class toolmaker, and he worked for us for many years down in Water Street in our tool room. Now this shows a side view of the Roadster, I think it is, with a frame and whatnot. These are all metal parts you see through here, and these are the ball joints to the rear, to the front wheel axles. And I think this is the ring gear on the back that for the chain drive or sprocket for this chain drive. And these pictures you don't see any detail at all. You just get the silhouette of the black car. That's apparently a front view of it, and these are the front axles in here and the tie rod coming across underneath. That's a view, I think. No, that's still from the front because there are the front axles. We're up to the 56 picture here. There's a side view of one of the chassis. That same picture of parts again. And there are several pictures in here of headlamps and taillights. This is a lamp picture there, and I think it would be right to say that all of these lamps were undoubtedly a product of Gray and Davis Lamp Company in Amesbury, because they were a well-known lamp company and supplied the carriages and automobiles in the day. That's another headlamp. That's a rear wheel assembly with the leaf springs. That's another spotlight. Another one. And that's some of the gear works in the drivetrain to the rear axle. Oh, here's the Bailey Company down in Seabrook has one of the original electrics that we had given to the Ford's Dearborn Village out in Detroit. We had 3 Bailey electrics and said, well, where can we put them so that they'd preserved and whatnot, and they were donated to the Ford Museum out there. And they had them on display. They had 3 of them, and this one was one that we got back from them on loan in 54 at the 100th anniversary, and we had it for a year, put automobile batteries in it, and we had it at different shows and at the shop outings and a few things like that. It was a great fun to drive. It just as quiet as anything. It's just like a sewing machine. You just step on the pedal in a sewing machine, it'll go faster and slower, and just as simple as that. And I had it home one day and let all of my children drive it around on the yard and the lawn, and this is now down at Seabrook. And the president of the current Bailey company invited me down last fall and gave me a tour of the plant, and I had an opportunity to take pictures of the electric at that time. And also they gave me a little present, and it was kind of sad. Back in the days when we were operating the company, we were making rolled metal shapes that were formed into parts for glass run channel to guide movable glass in the windows. And we had a lot of rolling machines. It was a specific trade in itself that we were skilled in. But we reached a point where we did expand and get into some molded plastic work. Well, when the Bailey company was acquired, they decided to push for the molded plastics end, and they abandoned the other end, and now there isn't a rolling machine left in the place. And the item that they were giving me as a present was a small ornate box, and there was one roll that had been in a rolling machine from the plant that had the type number of the channel section that it was making. And they said, well, we thought you'd like to have this. We were cleaning up the other day and ran into this roll. As far as we know, he said, it's the only roll left in the business that we had. He gave it to me. And I had several viewers of this.
Do they ever take them out, Sam?
Pardon?
Do they ever take
Oh, yes, they use it a lot in most of the parades around. And summer, winter, they get in the Santa Claus parade in the winter.
At the time they made their...
The upholstery in it is in very, very poor shape. It should be done over. It's all falling apart. The springs are coming out. And I suggested they should try LeBaron Bonney, and perhaps they could do the job for them. But they made some comment that they'd spoken to them and that they weren't interested. And so I don't know, but I'm surprised that they didn't. That's it. I'm just going to shut it off here. Yeah, any questions?
Sam, June used to tell about your aunts. They used to have that Bailey Electric that had a pillar on it.
Yeah.
And you could hear the chain. She said when she and some of the other kids would be around and see it, they'd run out and get in behind the hedge and afraid of it.
Yeah, they had, instead of having a whole steering wheel, they just had a little crank arm on it, like a tiller on a sailboat. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sam.
Now, do you have an estimation of how many were built?
How many of the electrics were ever built?
Yes.
I haven't any idea, and my greatest source of information failed me completely when I asked her.
I tried to find out how many were built when I was writing the Bailey history. And of the Bailey Electrics made, although I never found any actual records that would give me a figure. But I do know that, as Sam said, they sold to Yonkers, New York for their electric department use. They had a fleet of Bailey Electric cars in Salem for the use of their electric company. And I'm sure there were many other towns that did use the Bailey Electric. I know Amesbury did, for one, although I'm not sure whether the Baileys gave the electrics to the Amesbury company or not. I didn't find any record of their buying them, but I know they were used in Amesbury too.
My daughter Shirley sent me a clipping from the Worcester newspaper within the last year, and they showed a picture in the New England Electric repair barn or whatnot, where they had all of their vehicles, And they must have had 20 Bailey Electrics all lined right up in there, and that's what they were using for their service vehicles.
You know, the Bailey Electric, of course, one of the problems with any electric car at that time was that the charging of the batteries would last only so long. So they say, now Colonel Bailey, when he drove to Chicago, that was a trip of 8 days, and every night the electric was put on a charger when they stopped for overnight, and the next day they would also have to charge it again at about noon. So that would make 18 times that the car had to be charged between here and Chicago, right?
And sometimes they'd leave it they'd usually go to a power plant or whatnot, where they had the electricians that could rig up the charges for them.
Today, I understand.
Charge, and they'd climb the next morning and found out that somebody forgot to throw the switch.
Right.
So then they'd lose half a day getting charged.
Yeah. And I understand today that that isn't a great problem, that it's much easier to charge them. Of course, the Bailey Electric their batteries were a product of Edison in the beginning. He was one of their big suppliers of batteries.
Edison was developing a storage battery with high capacity and long life, and we were very much interested in having the best battery that we could get in order to prolong the distance that the vehicle could go, and they worked closely with him using his batteries. Now, they were extremely expensive, and I think it would cost $1,000 more for the Edison battery than it did the regular batteries. Now, they still today sell Edison batteries for fork trucks, and we used to use them in our electric fork trucks at the plant.
Sam mentions the expense of the batteries, but the expense of the car was not nearly what you would pay for a car today. Although I suppose at that time it was an expensive vehicle.
I think they were very expensive.
Well, that certainly was very interesting. Thank you a lot, Sam. Now I think I'll backtrack a little. In 1886, the Amesbury Village Improvement Society, an informal group who had been caring for roads, preserving town history, and other projects of town betterment since 1851, became formally organized under the name of the Amesbury Improvement Association. Since that time, I'm sure you all know the big part that group has played to make Amesbury an attractive and pleasant place in which to live. They own the historic sites, Alliance Park, the Patton's Pond Reservation, Golgotha, and the Captain's Well, all of which they maintain for the benefit of the people of Amesbury. In addition, they provide money for the various playgrounds about town. They help in the town forest, the Susanna Martin Marker, and the training field and the powder house. In 1899 occurred one of Amesbury's most destructive fires. The almost new Opera House on Main Street was burned, together with St. James Church and several adjacent buildings. Within a few months, the Wilman Block replaced the Opera House, and the present building of St. James Parish was built on the same lot as the old church. 1902 saw a spurt in substantial building in the town. The public library of today, what we call the old post office on Main Street, and a number of fine residential houses were built. The Highland District was being developed, and Dr. Herman Cooper bought the first automobile to be owned in town. In 1940,